Up for some questions, hostile or otherwise. I don't know the makeup of the audience here today. I do know there are very strong opinions about the war, and consequently there may be people on both sides of that issue who want to voice their opinions. And I want to assure you, as the chair of this meeting, you will be allowed to express your opinions regardless of what side of the coin you fall on. But I will not tolerate any disruptions. We do have security here. We'll ask people once or twice to quieten down, allow the presentation to proceed, and following that then we'll have you basically removed. So with those basic remarks, everybody will get an opportunity to make a statement, to ask your question, 2.5 minutes. And there's no back and forth going on, like Dimitri will answer each and every question. So, before I get into a few introductory remarks, I'm going to call upon Anna Jessup to come up and give the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Sid. We are on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas, of the Anishinaabe, of the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. This land is the home of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from all over Turtle Island. Settlers, such as myself, live and work here because of a legacy of colonial violence. The anti-colonial struggle for a just peace here on Turtle Island is connected to the anti-colonial struggle for peace worldwide. And we are here today to engage in that struggle.
Okay, that's perfect, thank you. So the first thing I'd just like to make a few brief remarks about is the entire issue of freedom of speech. We've attempted to hold this meeting, at least this is the second time in Toronto, but in other locations around the country there have been folks coming in to basically try to shut down a respectful debate and discussion. As I said earlier on, regardless of where you may stand on this issue, we should be able to express our opinions as openly as we wish, regardless of people in disagreement or not. I'm astonished that somehow folks will decide to protest against an individual, against Dimitri, who's basically talking about peace. I mean, when did it happen in Canada that a candidate for the leadership of the Green Party decides to make a tour and talk about the possibility of opening up dialogue and discussion leading to peace? How did that become out of favour in this country is beyond me. But in any event, I'm so delighted today, first off, to see all of you that showed up here today. I'm delighted with the courage of Dimitri to say, the hell with the last time you shut us down in Toronto, but you're not going to shut us down today. We will get our voices heard. And I will remind people that it's not so many years ago, well maybe it's 13, 14 years ago, that Jack Layton at one time stood up in the House of Parliament and he basically said this war in Afghanistan has got to end, and at some point we need to sit down and start to talk to the Taliban. And of course Stephen Harper at the time ridiculed him, calling him Taliban Jack. Well, only a couple of years later, guess what? There were peace talks going on with the Taliban. And as a matter of fact, that clown down in the United States, Donald Trump, he actually invited them into the White House. So, you know, it's just, over time you can begin to see, and there's no doubt in my mind, that a year from now, or maybe even less, there will be peace talks taking place. And people will say, geez, I remember Dimitri Lascaris was traveling the country and he got pilloried for suggesting that we have some peace talks leading to a settlement. You know, the origins of this dispute, you nearly need to go back 31 years, 32 years ago to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was all kinds of commitments made to Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would never move an inch towards the Russian border, and within a matter of years they'd signed up 13 or 14 satellite countries that made up the previous Soviet Union and had basically nuclear weapons pointing towards Moscow after promising faithfully that that would never happen. Russia made it clear that, in fact, Ukraine was the red line that would never be crossed without some sort of major conflict, and here we are today. Now, it's not so long ago, about a little matter of months, as a matter of fact, after the war began, there were talks taking place, high-level discussions taking place between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, the other clown from the UK, Boris Johnson, hops on a plane, arrives in Kiev, and essentially told Zelensky, they put him in place to say there will be no discussions and no talks with the Russians. They basically want a war of attrition, and after maybe killing tens of thousands more Ukrainians, then maybe they'll be prepared to sit down and talk about peace. This is the essence of what Dimitri is going to be talking about this afternoon. He is essentially, on his own dime, went into Russia and spoke to Russians, the average person on the street, and he has a perspective that I think we all need to hear. So anyway, with that, I just want to introduce Dimitri. From 2012 to 2022, Dimitri was a correspondent and a board member of the Real News Network. He's also served on the boards of numerous other public interest not-for-profit corporations, including the Unity Project for the Relief of Homelessness, Pro Bono Ontario, and Toronto 350. 2014, Dimitri presented Toronto's 350's fossil fuels and divestment petition to the President of the University of Toronto. In Canada 2015 election, Dimitri ran for the Green Party of Canada in the riding of London West. Subsequently, he served as Justice Critic in the Shadow Cabinet for the Green Party of Canada and Justice Critic in the Green Party of Quebec. In 2018, he was elected as a member of the PVQ's Executive Committee. In March of 2020, Dimitri announced his candidacy for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. The leadership contest concluded in October 2020. Dimitri finished in second place out of 8 candidates, garnering 45.5% of the votes on the 8th and final ballot. Sisters and brothers, I give you Dimitri Lascaris.
It is a great honor to be here today, and first and foremost, I want to express my gratitude and my respect for my brother Sid. I first came to know Sid in the context of the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, which I regard as a litmus test for political and moral integrity in this country. Brother Sid has always passed that litmus test with flying colors. His support for the Palestinian cause, because it's the right thing to do, is implacable. And I have nothing but respect for this man. And when he stood up today, I had no idea what he was going to say. And I agree with every word of it. Not the parts about me, but the parts about this conflict. The parts about this conflict, he's got it dead right. And I know that Sid always has a clarity of vision that distinguishes him from so many political and labor leaders in this country, and I'm honored to have him here today as our moderator. And I'm also honored deeply by the efforts of our local organizers whose determination is also implacable. Thank you so much. Originally, I was scheduled to speak 12 times on this tour, starting in my hometown of London, Ontario on June 19th and ending. It was supposed to end with a national webinar on July 4th after I spoke in the nation's capital on July 3rd, I believe it was. And the local organizers said to me, we refused, because this was the one place, Toronto of all places, the nation's largest city, it was the one place where they successfully deplatformed us. We had a cancellation. We had cancellations in other cities, including my own hometown where I currently live, Montreal. We had cancellation in Halifax. We had 2 cancellations in Winnipeg. We overcame all of them. But this was the one city where we did not overcome the cancellation until today. And I bow to the organizers for saying we're not going to put up with this attempt to silence us. We're just a set of voices in the national conversation about this existentially dangerous war, and all we have to say is we deserve to be heard. And let Canadians then decide. That's all this is about. So, why did I embark on this tour at the request of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, led particularly by Ken Stone, Brendan at the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War? I knew that this was going to be a difficult experience. I think we all knew that months ago we all figured out that having this types of conversations were very difficult in this country. The reason, frankly, is because I believe that we are living through the most dangerous moment in human history. I'd go so far as to say in human history. And I'll start by pointing out that on November 22nd of last year, we were almost plunged into World War III. And some of us, a lot of us may have forgotten what happened on that day. What happened on that day is that 2 missiles left Ukrainian airspace and landed in Poland, which obviously is a NATO member. And it killed 2 farmers in an agricultural area of the country. And as you can see here, this is an article, I believe, from Reuters. It's a major Western media organization. The ubiquitous, the ever-present, anonymous U.S. intelligence official came forward and pontificated on a nameless basis to the Western media about where those missiles came from. And what we were told by this anonymous U.S. intelligence official was that the missiles had been fired by Russia. Now, if he had been telling the truth, Article 5 of the NATO treaty would have been triggered, and you'll know, if you've read that treaty, that military force to come to the defense, the collective defense of an attacked member, is an obligation, or at least consideration of military force, is an obligation under the NATO treaty. Fortunately, the few sane voices left in the Western leadership came out and acknowledged within 24 to 48 hours that in fact the missiles had not been fired by Russia, but had been fired by our ally, the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian government. Whether this was done intentionally or unintentionally, I don't purport to have an answer to that question, but there is unanimity now in NATO. Poland came out and said this, the US government came out and said this, Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said this. These missiles were fired by Ukrainian forces. But our ally, Volodymyr Zelensky, continued to insist that in fact they had been fired by Russia. And you'll see this quote from a British media outlet at the end of the 3rd paragraph. But even after it was accepted that the missile had not been fired by the Russians, accepted by the leadership of NATO, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continued to claim it was a Russian attack on NATO. And this is something that this man has done repeatedly in this conflict. He's tried to suck us into World War III. He did it at the very outset of this conflict when he said that NATO needed to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which would have meant direct conflict with a nuclear-armed state by NATO. He did it again here, and he did it again in every single opportunity he's had, including when he claimed that it was in fact the Russians who blew up Nord Stream. And now NATO powers acknowledge, the US government itself acknowledges that it wasn't Russia that blew up Nord Stream, although it itself denies responsibility. The Americans are now pointing their finger at the Ukrainian government. And we also heard that the Russians were going to blow up the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant for Mr. Zelensky. He was saying this relentlessly over the last week or two. And then the head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, came out and said, we sent people up on the roof where the Ukrainians said that they had put explosives, the Russians, we didn't see anything. This man is trying to suck us into World War III, and we're holding him out as the colossus bestriding the geopolitical stage, the champion of democracy. No, he's not our friend, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just me who's saying this is the most dangerous moment in human history. There are many people who are far more accomplished than myself, far more influential than I will ever be, who are saying this, including Noam Chomsky. And what Professor Chomsky points out is not just the nuclear war potential of this conflict. All of this is happening against the backdrop of a climate crisis that is spinning out of control. And unless we can achieve, we as in the peoples of this world, a level of international cooperation that is unprecedented, we have no hope of bringing this climate crisis under control. Within the last 2 weeks or so, we've had 3 or 4 consecutive days that were the hottest days on Earth in recorded history. How are we going to solve this climate crisis when the major emitters are all at war with each other? There's no hope, none whatsoever. We must bring this war to an end. And I say to you, if you're a climate activist, take off your climate cap and put on your anti-war cap now. Because you ain't going to solve the climate crisis as long as this war is going on. It's instructive, thinking about the danger of this moment, to go back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and how the West responded to that. I'm old enough to remember. I was born in the early 60s, and I remember that some character named Charlie Wilson in the United States Congress came up with the brilliant idea to fund weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan for the purpose of killing Soviet soldiers. And this became the subject of a book, and the book became the subject of a Hollywood movie starring Tom Hanks. And I have up on the screen here a photograph of the cover of that book, which sits on my bookshelf, and you'll see the subheading, The Extraordinary Story of the Largest Covert Operation in History. Covert. What were they providing covertly to the Mujahideen, who later morphed into Al-Qaeda and were responsible for 9/11? What they were providing were weapons that were far less lethal than the weapons we are currently providing to the Ukrainians. They were providing shoulder-based Stinger missiles. They were providing small arms. They were providing RPGs. They weren't providing Patriot missile systems. They weren't providing heavy battle tanks to the Mujahideen. They weren't providing ATACMS missiles. And yet they felt the need to do it covertly. These much less lethal weapons. Now they're falling over each other to brag about who is the most avid supporter of the Ukrainian state. Now you may say that this is justified. This is morally correct. But let's not kid ourselves here. We are flaunting to the Russian people that we are fueling a war and giving to their enemy, which is a few hundred kilometers from Moscow, the most lethal weapon, almost the most lethal weaponry in our conventional arsenals. We're not hiding it anymore. Our sense of restraint has gone out the window. We don't even have the good sense to do what Charlie Wilson did and try to do all of this secretly. No, we're bragging about it. So how will I proceed? I've explained to you why I've done this tour at the request of the network. I'd like to sort of lay out for you how I propose to proceed today. I'm going to tell you what my position on this war is. Then I'd like to explain to you the basis of my position. Then I'd like to talk about what I learned from my journey to Russia. And finally, I'd like to talk about what a peace deal might look like. So what is my position? No, I'm not supporting the invasion of Ukraine, as has been claimed repeatedly. I don't want war. I'm opposed to war. I want a peaceful resolution to this conflict. My view, which I've articulated consistently, is that we should do 6 things. Number 1, we should provide robust humanitarian aid for the innocent victims of the war. And that aid should be delivered directly to the Ukrainian people because the Ukrainian government is too corrupt to be trusted with the aid. And there are lots of NGOs out there that are independent of any government that can do this job. Secondly, we should provide sanctuary for those Ukrainians who have fled the war zone. But we shouldn't do that in preference to other peoples of the world who are fleeing war zones, including in particularly war zones that our governments themselves are complicit in having created. So they shouldn't be given preference over Afghan refugees, Iraqi refugees, Libyan refugees, Syrian refugees. All refugees are equal. They all deserve our robust protection. Number 3, an arms embargo on the warring parties, both sides. No weapons. Number 4, no economic sanctions that are not approved by the United Nations. Number 5, a legal prohibition on Canadian citizens participating in this war as combatants, whether on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. And finally, support for negotiations. We should offer our services as a mediator if those services are desired, but we can only do that if we are truly perceived by both parties as being neutral. And right now, it's anything but neutrality from the Canadians. We are in this up to our necks. We are waging war on Russia, and we should not be deluding ourselves about that. Now, some people will say my position is an outlier. It's fringe, it's extreme. Well, there was a poll done by the National Post and Leger in February of this year, which showed that only 32%, if you look at this screen at the bottom, the second line from the bottom, providing military equipment. You'll see that only 32% thought we should provide more military equipment to the Ukrainians. 43% thought that we should, 36% thought we should just maintain the status quo. 17% thought that we should do less, we should not provide as much as we're providing. And 15% said I don't know, I don't have an answer. So how fringe is this perspective really in Canada that we should not be providing weapons to the Ukrainians? A significant proportion of the Canadian population is already very skeptical about what we're doing. A majority don't want us to provide more weapons. And this is happening in a media environment in which only the voices that support war and escalation are allowed to speak. Those of us we've seen on this tour what happens to those of us who say that we shouldn't be arming either side to the conflict. What about people's views about the potential for nuclear war? There was a poll that came out in this country just 2 weeks ago which showed that 53% of Canadians believe that this is likely to result in a nuclear exchange. I find this horrifying. How can it be that 53% of Canadians believe that we are going to find ourselves in short order in a nuclear exchange, and there are not millions of people out in the streets demanding a negotiated resolution to this war? What does it take for people to be awakened from their slumber? How deeply propagandized has our society become that 53% of our fellow citizens can believe, as I do, that we're heading towards a nuclear war, but they're sitting there thinking complacently that it'll all work out in the end. You know, maybe what our fellow citizens who believe this and who are not protesting, who are not coming out and participating in conversations like this, maybe they've convinced themselves that there's such a thing as a small nuclear war. This is a fantasy. There ain't no such thing. And this article, which comes from, it's a statement from the Arms Control Center in the United States from June 2019, said exactly that. There's no such thing as a small nuclear war. The basis of that was they've run war games, simulations, and they found that every time that once the bombs start flying, we're all dead. It escalates rapidly to a general thermonuclear war. And there's another reason, a scientific reason why this is fantasy, that there's such a thing as a small nuclear war. It's called nuclear winter. All it takes is a limited exchange of nuclear weapons to put so much soot into the skies that they block out the sun, and we are engulfed basically by an agricultural crisis. We will no longer have the food supply for years on end to sustain the human population. Billions of people would die. That's all it takes, a small nuclear exchange to bring about a nuclear winter. There's no such thing, ladies and gentlemen, as a small nuclear war. And if you think that's where we're headed, which apparently over half the population does, there's no better reason than that to be out in the streets protesting and demanding a negotiated resolution to this war. Now, I've been talking to you about Canadian attitudes. What about global attitudes towards this war? This is a map compiled by the intelligence unit of The Economist magazine, about as pro-Ukraine and pro-NATO a Western media organization as you're going to find. And what it shows, you'll see up here in gray the countries that have not provided weapons to Ukraine, and the darker countries are those that have provided weapons to Ukraine. Almost nobody in Latin America, including our own close trading partner, Mexico, has provided weapons to Ukraine. Virtually nobody in Africa, virtually nobody in the Middle East, and virtually nobody in Asia has provided weapons to Ukraine. A vast majority of the countries representing a vast majority of the human population has decided not to introduce weapons into this conflict for either side. So the position that I've articulated to you is mainstream globally. We're told the international community supports what we're doing, what our governments in the West are doing. This is a crock. The international community is not confined to the West. Globally, we are mainstream, those of us who argue against the arming of Ukraine. What about sanctions? Again, this is from the intelligence unit of The Economist. Almost nobody in Latin America, including our close trading partner Mexico, has imposed sanctions. The countries in gray are those that have decided not to impose sanctions. Virtually nobody in Africa, nobody in the Middle East, nobody in Asia, other than Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, representing a tiny population of the Asian population, have decided not to have decided to impose sanctions on Russia. So again, the position I've articulated on sanctions is mainstream globally. Now, before I tell you that's my position Before I tell you why, I'd like to say a few words about thinking critically about this war. It's something we seem, especially on the left, the so-called left, to have lost the capacity to do over the last 18 months. But what I notice when I read the Western media, and I do pay careful attention, although I don't trust them, I pay careful attention to what they're saying about this war, is that the vast majority of their articles about this war are based upon one of, or more of three sources: the US government, the British government, or the Ukrainian government. If you don't believe me, take a look and see for yourself. Who are they quoting to support the claims that they're making about this war? I want to talk about the first two, the US and British governments. The Pentagon Papers, which were heroically revealed to us by Daniel Ellsberg, who tragically passed away recently, and by the way, who argued right up until his death that this war was provoked by NATO, they showed beyond a shadow of a doubt that 4 successive US presidential administrations lied relentlessly about the Vietnam War and about what was being done to Cambodia and to Laos. These were monstrosities. They lied. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the claim that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction was also a bald-faced lie, as was the claim that Hussein was involved in 9/11. That was a crock. And we know from the Afghanistan papers, which have received a lot less attention in the West than the Pentagon papers, that the 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan was based on a pack of lies. We were told, amongst other things, that we were going over there to protect women. Who's in power today, ladies and gentlemen? After 20 years and trillions of dollars and thousands upon thousands of deaths. The Taliban, the very people who were oppressing the women of Afghanistan 20 years ago. Where is NATO today? Where did all that money go? Where is all their nobility and heroism? These people are bald-faced liars. How often do we have to be lied to by the US and British governments before we finally say, we don't believe you anymore? Nothing you say yes. We can disagree about a lot of things on this war, but the one thing we should all be able to agree upon is that when the United States government intervenes militarily in another country, it ain't for noble purposes. Now, what about the Ukrainian government as a source of information? Well, Josep Borrell, the titular head of foreign policy for the European Union, said in a recent interview that if we stop supporting Ukraine, Ukraine will lose this war in a matter of days. And this is one of the few moments in which Josep Borrell has actually been honest. Anybody can see from the economic and political evidence from a range of sources that Ukraine is now critically dependent for its survival, the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian government, on Western government support. And a few days after Borrell said this, the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius went further and said that if we stop supporting Ukraine, Ukraine will disappear tomorrow. There's a good deal of truth to this. Now, just stop and think critically, rationally. What kind of an incentive does this create? If you are dependent for your very survival upon the support of Western governments, and you know that to some degree at least, their freedom of action is constrained by public opinion, that they can't do whatever they want, that there are consequences at the ballot box, you have a profound incentive to inflame Western public opinion against your enemy. You will do everything you can to convince people in the West that Vladimir Putin is evil, that he's the next Hitler, and that if he defeats Ukraine, he's coming after you. This is inevitable. It's human nature. Any government in the position of the Ukrainian government would have the same incentive. So, can we really take at face value what the Ukrainian government tells us about this war? About what's happening on the battlefield? About its own conduct? Or should we take it with a grain of salt? The way I approach, and I recommend to you that you approach, claims about this war, whether they be coming from Russia, from allies of Russia, from Ukraine, from the Brits, from the Americans, from our own government, is don't believe anything they tell you unless it is corroborated by independent, objective evidence. Look at the historical record, look at the evidence available to you, and decide, is this sensible? Is this credible? Is this plausible? And if you don't have enough evidence to decide that, then withhold your judgment. And say, I'm not going to render an opinion. I'm not going to take a position on whether this claim or that claim is true until I have better evidence. But instead, what we've been doing in the West, if we have been rushing to believe, mindlessly believing, and I see this on the left, and it's so distressing to me as a leftist to see this from my comrades, mindlessly believing whatever the Brits and the Americans and the Ukrainians tell us, and mindlessly assuming that anything the Russian government says is false, even if there's evidence to support it. Does the Russian government disseminate propaganda? Of course! But just as our governments do. We have to try to exercise our own judgment about who's lying and who's telling the truth. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have to have the courage to say it. Sometimes the Russian government tells the truth. They want you to believe that everything that comes out of their mouth is a lie. That's just not the case. And I hope to show that to you by the end of this presentation. If the US government's objective in Ukraine is not democracy and human rights and international law, and I think that's something we can all safely conclude, let's remember that this clown, Biden, who is currently the President of the United States and is leading this policy, supported the Iraq War. And was he held accountable for it? No. Why would we believe this man? Is it possible that some other US president might one day take office who's honest, who has integrity, who's moral? Of course it's possible. But this guy? You're going to take this clown's word for it? This is about US global hegemony. And this is not speculation. You can find this in statements, analyses published by the RAND Corporation, by Stratfor. You can find this in indiscreet statements that are made from time to time by senior US officials. The clear objective is to weaken a geopolitical rival. And if they succeed by some miracle in defeating Russia on its border, the next target is clearly China. I mean, come on. We can see it. It's happening before our eyes. They're setting us up for a war in the South China Sea. They're arming Taiwan. They're trying to use Ukraine as a bulwark against Russia, because Russia has become a geopolitical rival. And the next target is the bigger one, is China. And if we manage by some miracle to survive this conflict in Ukraine, which a majority of Canadians now believe is heading towards nuclear war, don't fool yourselves. We will not survive a direct conflict between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We're finished. We're done like dinner. That's what this war is about. It has nothing to do with the noble objectives constantly being invoked by our governments. So what are the true causes of this war? Again, let's think critically about this. We're told that the Russian claim that they were fearful of NATO expansion and that NATO expansion was a betrayal of a commitment made to Gorbachev is a Putin talking point. Really? A Putin talking point. Well, you can go look at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, which contains dozens of declassified documents, and see for yourselves that in fact a range of leaders, the head of NATO, Manfred Werner at the time, Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, François Mitterrand, the President of France, Secretary Baker of the United States, and many more, all assured Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward if Russia or the Soviet Union did not oppose the reunification of Germany. Another cause of this war, again, we're told this is a Putin talking point, is that there is a serious problem with neo-Nazism in Ukraine. We know, for example, that Senator John McCain, before he passed away, a bloodthirsty neocon, if ever there was one, was standing on stages beside, people from the right sector in Kiev, a far-right ultranationalist organization expressing solidarity and support for the right sector and those like them in Ukraine, and urging them to seek the removal of a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, who at the time was simply trying to maintain good relations with both Russia and the EU. We're told that he was a Putin stooge. He actually was trying to get along with everybody, which was in the interests of the Ukrainian people. And for that unpardonable sin, he was overthrown. And how do we know he was overthrown? Well, aside from the fact that US officials like McCain were going into Kiev at the time and were egging on the protesters, we have a recording of a conversation between Victoria Nuland, who at the time was a senior US State Department official with responsibility over Eastern Europe and who has now been elevated to an even more important position, and the US ambassador to Ukraine at the time. Jeffrey Pyatt. And in this conversation, which happened a few weeks before Yanukovych was overthrown violently, Pyatt says to Nuland, the Europeans seem to favor Valery Klitschko as the next prime minister of Ukraine. Valery Klitschko, I believe, is currently the mayor of Kiev. And Nuland says, you know what? Fuck the EU. Just straight up, fuck the EU. That's what she says. And then Pyatt, and she says, Yats is the guy. Yats being Yevgeny Yatsenyuk, a neoliberal who at that time was in the political opposition in Ukraine. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, Yats becomes the prime minister of Ukraine. Over the objections of the Europeans. Now let's imagine, people, let's do a little hypothesizing here. And imagine that the facts were inverted. And rather than this being a conversation between Nuland and Pyatt, this was a 2016 conversation between Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation's ambassador to the United States at the time. And in that conversation, let's suppose this was intercepted by the CIA and it was published, and the Russians don't deny the authenticity of the recording. You can hear the US or the Russian ambassador to the United States saying to Lavrov, the Chinese, they don't like Trump. They think he's going to be more belligerent than Hillary. They favor Hillary. And Lavrov says, fuck the Chinese. And then he blurts out, Trump is the guy. Trump is the guy. And several weeks later, Trump defeats Hillary in a shock electoral result. Is there anybody in the United States Congress in those circumstances, anybody in the US Senate, anybody in the White House who would deny that there had been a coup? Who would say, oh no, nothing to see here, move along. The integrity of US democracy has been preserved. The Russians didn't interfere. Of course they would all sing from the same song sheet and tell us without any hesitation that there had been a subversion of American democracy. But when the Americans do it in Ukraine, it's a Putin talking point. What else is it true? But by the way, if you don't believe me in my assessment of this evidence, take into account the opinion of George Friedman, who is the CEO of Stratfor, a US-based geopolitical consulting firm, who told a Russian magazine in 2014 that this was the most blatant coup in history. That was his assessment. What else is a cause of the war in Ukraine? Yes, there is a problem with Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Absolutely. Now, I could show you plenty of photographs and videos of people from the Azov Battalion, for example, sporting Nazi insignia, flaunting them. But I'm going to focus on one fact, which is little talked about in the West, and that is in December 2018, the Ukrainian parliament, not some fringe far-right party, but the parliament itself, adopted a national holiday for Stepan Bandera.
Yeah.
Stepan Bandera was a Nazi collaborator during the Second World War. He co-founded an organization, the OUN, which was a participant in the mass slaughter of tens of thousands of Poles, Jews, and Russians. So heinous is this man's record that this year, in the middle of a war, the Polish government, which is a close ally of the Ukrainian state in this war, complained bitterly and publicly about the fact that under torchlight marches on January 1st of this year, people in Kiev were out in the streets honoring the legacy of Stepan Bandera. If the Poles find this offensive, how can we not find this offensive? They are as close an ally of Ukraine as possible. And if this isn't bad enough, Lev Golinkin, who's a Ukrainian-American author and analyst, pointed out that in 2015, the Ukrainian parliament actually made it a criminal offense to deny the heroism of Bandera and his ilk. And we're told this is the champion of democracy, the Ukrainian state. They made it a criminal offense to deny the heroism of a Nazi collaborator who helped to orchestrate the mass slaughter of Jews, Poles, and Russians. This is the state that we are arming to the teeth. Even in this country, it came to light, not by a pro-Putin newspaper, but by the Ottawa Citizen, part of the right-wing post-media empire, that Canada had trained neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military. And when the Canadian military leaders became fearful that this would become known. Did they try to stop this from happening? No. What they became concerned about is how are we going to conceal that it happened from the Canadian public. This was reported by the Ottawa Citizen. Another cause of this war. Again, we're told that history started on February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded, as though everything before that was an irrelevancy. No, there was actually a civil war going on in the southeast of Ukraine from 2014. When Yanukovych was overthrown, and all the people who voted for him felt that their vote had been stolen from them, and some 15,000 people died in that conflict. This war began, ladies and gentlemen, in 2014. It didn't begin in February of last year. It was escalated in February of last year. But it was a serious cause for the invasion that ultimately transpired. So why should we oppose this war? In summary, first of all, I can't think of a more compelling reason, because we are heading towards nuclear Armageddon. That in and of itself is a reason for every single person in this room, every single Canadian, to get out in the streets and to demand a negotiated resolution to this war as quickly as humanly possible. Secondly, I would say, relying upon military experts, and I am not one, that Ukraine has no realistic prospect of winning this war. Why do I say that? Well, Western sources have repeatedly acknowledged that Russia has a massive advantage in artillery, and that the vast majority of people who are being killed and wounded in this war are being killed and wounded by artillery. Not only does Russia have a massive advantage in artillery, but it also has a population now, after millions of people have left Ukraine and millions of other Ukrainians have come under the control of Russian forces, which is effectively 1/5 the size of the Russian population. So Russia has up to a 10-to-1 advantage in artillery, up to a 5-to-1 advantage in population. This is a war of attrition in which the vast majority of people are being killed and wounded by artillery. The math is inexorable. Ukraine will run out of fighting age men long before the Russian Federation runs out of fighting age men. This is just on the basis of artillery and population. But then you throw into the mix the fact that Russia has a much larger air force than Ukraine, the fact that Russia has hypersonic missiles, and no Western state has hypersonic missiles, the fact that Russia has far greater oil resources, which are essential to the conduct and sustainment of large-scale land warfare, the fact that Russia has a much larger industrial base than Ukraine. Ukraine has lost the capacity effectively to produce the kinds of weapons that are necessary for large-scale land warfare. Russia has cranked up its industry and is in fact producing far more of these things than was the case prior to this invasion. So even if the only thing you care about is the preservation of the Ukrainian state and the survival of the Ukrainian people, and you're not worried about nuclear war, you're not worried about whether Russia has legitimate complaint, you're not worried about the complicity of our governments in this travesty, if all you care about is the Ukrainians, you should still advocate passionately for a negotiated solution to this war as quickly as humanly possible, because the path we're on is going to result in the destruction of Ukraine. There is no viable path to victory as the West defines it, which is the expulsion of Russian forces from all of the territory of Ukraine at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's simply not realistic. That's the reality. Another reason to support the resolution of this war as quickly as possible by negotiation is that, we're told if we keep pumping weapons into Ukraine, we're going to strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position. In fact, it's getting weaker. How do we know? Bakhmut, the bloodiest battle of the war, which went on for months and months, tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Ukraine lost that battle within the last 2 months. And Volodymyr Zelensky himself said that if the Russians took Bakhmut, then the way was open for the Russians to go all the way to the Dnieper River and complete the conquest of the Donbass. Well, that's happened now. At least at this point in time, Ukraine has access to the Black Sea through Odessa and the areas surrounding Odessa. But if it gets weaker and weaker to the point where the Russians could march largely unopposed into more westerly parts of Ukraine, it may lose access to the Black Sea, which would be a strategic disaster for the country. we have to ask ourselves, is this really strengthening the position of the Ukrainian state? Or will this ultimately result in Ukraine becoming a rump state, a landlocked rump state that is an economic and social disaster zone? I would suggest to you that the latter is the course of action that we have decided to pursue. Another reason to oppose this war is that Russia does have, yes, ladies and gentlemen, it must be said, some legitimate grievances. NATO expansion, US interference in the internal politics of Ukraine, which violated the US commitment made in the Budapest Memorandum, tolerance of and support for Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and attacks on pro-Russian Ukrainians in the Donbass. These are legitimate issues. Of course, there are many legitimate complaints that the Ukrainian side has, but to pretend that only one side is right and the other side has nothing to say in its defense is what I call the Star Wars view of this war. What is the Star Wars view of this war? It's that Volodymyr Zelensky is Obi-Wan Kenobi and Vladimir Putin is Darth Vader. And we are on the side of light and goodness, and the Russian Federation is on the side of evil. Well, the world is not a Hollywood blockbuster, my friends. It is not that simple. It's much more complex than that. We should reject this narrative before it gets us all killed. Another reason to oppose this war is it is an environmental catastrophe. The destruction of Nord Stream, which, yes, was probably perpetrated by the American government, which was saying for decades that it wanted to bring an end to Nord Stream, and had the capacity and opportunity to do this, it was the largest single release of methane in recorded history. There was a dam destroyed in the southeast of Ukraine. Everybody agrees it was an ecological disaster. This happened in the last few weeks. Of course, we're told over and over again it was the Russians, just as we're told that Nord Stream was the Russians. They now admit it wasn't the Russians, and one day they may well end up admitting that this dam's destruction was not the Russians either. I personally don't know who destroyed it, but I can tell you with a high degree of confidence it was an ecological disaster. There's no doubt about that. We're also being told by the head of Interpol that all these weapons we're sending into Ukraine, a good part of them are going to end up in the hands of criminal organizations and neo-Nazis. And finally, there's the cost. Some $150 billion, $200 billion have been spent on by the West on this war. This is money that could go to helping the homeless in our countries, to helping alleviate poverty, to strengthening our rapidly deteriorating healthcare systems, to helping us to transition rapidly to a renewable energy economy, but instead it's being gobbled up by merchants of death in a war that will end in the destruction of the Ukrainian people. This is a calamity and a travesty and an outrage of the highest proportions. And it's time for everybody to get worked up about it. So the third part of my presentation, I'll talk to you a little bit about my trip to Russia. I went there in April of this year from the 1st to the 30th of the month. I was in Moscow and in Crimea. I was not paid any compensation to go there by anybody, nor have I been paid a penny of compensation to write dozens of articles about this war, which I have, and you can find them on my website. I've not been paid any compensation to do interviews about this war, about our relations with Russia. I've not been paid any compensation to speak on this tour. And in fact, all the expenses that I incurred in the course of doing all these things, I bore by myself, 100% of them. And I did that because I'm privileged to be in a position to do that, but also because I didn't want anybody to be able to question what my motivations are. You can disagree with me, you can say I'm dead wrong about this stuff, but you got no basis to claim that I am motivated by financial considerations, as some people have been saying. The other thing I need to say is that by way of disclaimer, okay, Russia's obviously a massive, complex country. My trip was limited to central Moscow, and I took a train down to Crimea, 28-hour train ride, and then I did go all over Crimea, but that left a huge part of that part of the world that I've never visited. So I can't purport to tell you what's going on in those parts of the world, and even the parts of the world that I visited, I was only there for a few weeks. I didn't do any polls. I don't have any scientific polling data to provide to you. So take what I'm going to tell you with a grain of salt and understand its limitations, but I nonetheless think it's useful information for you to consider when you try to assess how we should respond to this war. And by the way, I was not invited. There was no welcoming committee. This was a decision I made on my own initiative. And I should say also, and I've disclosed this readily, nobody outed me on this. I went on my own initiative and told people that after I got my visa, I contacted on my own initiative the Russian embassy in Ottawa. And I did that because I didn't know what I was going to do when I got down there. I didn't know anybody. And I did want to speak to some foreign ministry officials about the possibility of having a peace negotiation. And thankfully, the Russian ambassador, whom I had never spoken to before, 2 weeks before my departure, agreed to speak to me by Zoom. And we spent about 60 minutes talking about what I might do while I was in Russia. And he kindly put me in touch with foreign ministry officials with whom I met for 2 hours in Moscow, and also with a think tank called IMIMO. It's described as Russia's largest think tank, and there I had a meeting with some 20 to 25 experts for 2 hours in a conference room that was about this big. And I was allowed to just pepper them with questions, whatever I wanted to ask them. And they were experts in economic matters, financial matters, sanctions, military matters, and I found that to be an enlightening experience.
Why did you have that experience?
I'm sorry?
Why did you have that experience?
Which experience?
When you had the people in front of you, taking, telling the Martins and helping?
Could you save your question for the Q&A? May I? I'm happy to answer your question in the Q&A, but I think we're trying to do this in a certain way that preserves the orderliness of this. And you can go first. I'm happy for you to go first in the Q&A. Okay. So during that initial stage in Moscow, I spoke at the Valdai Club with Professor Radhika Desai of the University of Manitoba, who happened to be in Moscow at the time, and we talked about the movement away from the use of the US dollar in global trade, and the Valdai Club is an economic think tank in Russia. I spoke at McGill University, which is primarily an institution that trains Russian diplomats. I gave a lecture on Canadian foreign policy. It wasn't a particularly complimentary lecture to a bunch of graduate students who spoke fluent English. As I mentioned, I spoke with people at the Russian Foreign Ministry. The person I spoke to, by the way, had been serving in the Russian embassy in Ottawa and was expelled by Canada. The Canadian government expelled him because he publicized the fact that Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was a Nazi collaborator. And I'm not relying upon him when I tell you this. I'm relying upon reports at the time in the Toronto Star. Thomas Walkham wrote an article about this in which he said exactly what I've told you. The Globe and Mail acknowledged this. The National Post acknowledged this. That's why he was expelled from Canada. And we had a very interesting discussion about what a peace deal might look like, and I'll come back to that in the last part of my presentation. I also went to a homeless shelter operated by a charity because when I was walking in central Moscow, I saw far fewer visibly homeless people than I see in any major Western city. And I thought, this can't be real. How could there be so few homeless people in a country that's being pummeled by sanctions? And so I went there, and what they told me was, yes, the problem of homelessness is probably worse than what you see in central Moscow, but it's really more or less what you'd encounter in any capitalist society. And Russia is a capitalist society, fundamentally. In which, by the way, if you know my political position, I am opposed to capitalism. I'm an implacable critic of capitalism. So I'm no fan of the Russian economic system. Be very clear about that. But I didn't see any evidence that that system is more inhumane than the system in which we live. And the system which we're told every day by our corporate media is the best system. I also did an interview on RT. I was invited, it was actually the title of this presentation, One Handshake at a Time, Citizen Diplomacy. I'm not the author of that title. That came from the program Worlds Apart, which interviewed me for half an hour about my trip in Russia. And I want to say something about this, the fact that I appear in RT, because I'm constantly pilloried about this. Constantly. This is the #1 complaint that my opponents articulate. Why do I appear in RT? I appear in RT for a very simple reason. They have an audience. It's a significant audience that I can't reach on social media, where I have fewer than 20,000 followers, and they allow me to say whatever I want. As simple as that. So if you have an audience of some millions of people around the world, and you let me say whatever I want, I'm going to take you up on the offer. And I would say the same thing if the CBC or CNN or CTV offered me the opportunity to pontificate about Canadian foreign policy. But they won't. And do we really believe that they are not disseminators of propaganda? I mean, come on. I mean, of course RT disseminates some propaganda. Of course it has a pro-Russian perspective. But you could say exactly the same thing about our television stations and our print media. There's no question about that, ladies and gentlemen. You know, so if I'm given a platform and you let me express my opinion, I'll take it, and I didn't do any of that for money. So I categorically reject the idea that I should not be accepting invitations from RT to speak to their audience. You know, as I say, I'm happy to do that in the Canadian American media, but they just don't want to hear from me. Now, I also went to Crimea. As I mentioned, I took a train down there. I went to Yalta. That's where I started my trip, and I visited that historic site where Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt basically laid out the post-war architecture in Europe, came to an agreement about that. I went to Balaclava, which is a Soviet-era decommissioned nuclear submarine base. I went there in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, and I was in there entirely by myself, and it was a tremendously humbling experience. Because on the one hand, it was reassuring to me to know as I was seeing these nuclear-tipped decommissioned missiles in this base in a cave, but at the same time, I had to remind myself that we are even at a more dangerous, perilous moment now than we were at the height of the Cold War. I was in Sebastopol, the headquarters of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet. There was a drone attack there at the time, but that didn't result in any casualties. It was the one time that I had sort of direct interaction with the war. On the whole Crimea, there was very little evidence other than that incident and my visit to the border of Crimea and Kherson that there was actually a war going on. Everything seemed to be orderly. People were somber. They understood that there was a war going on, but there was no sign of crisis, and I didn't see any sign of crisis in Moscow itself. Although clearly people understood that the situation is a perilous one. Now, I'd like to summarize for you what I heard and learned. First of all, I spoke to dozens of people in Crimea, and not one of them expressed a desire to return to the government or the rule of Ukraine. Every single one of them said, we want to be part of Russia. And I didn't get the sense, for what it's worth, that anybody was afraid to tell me the truth. They were adamant. They want nothing to do with Volodymyr Zelensky and his government. And they feel Russian. And Poles have supported that consistently, as does the history. It was part of the Russian Federation for some 200 years, and for reasons that historians struggle to understand, Khrushchev, when Ukraine and Russia were part of the same country, transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. I don't think anybody at that point in time was imagining that one day, in the not too distant future, Russia and Ukraine would be separate countries. Who knows what Khrushchev would have done if he knew that? The fact of the matter is, though, that there are deep historical and cultural connections between Crimea and Russia. If we're going to solve this war, we need to take that reality into account. In terms of how people felt about the Russian government in Russia itself, I did not hear anybody criticize the Russian government from the left. What I heard was people say either we support what Russia's doing or Russia is not being aggressive enough. Russia should have intervened sooner, before the NATO forces built up the Ukrainian military to the point where it became a serious and formidable force. So my sense is that we are actually radicalizing the Russian population. I spoke to a lot of people, including a fellow by the name of Sergei Gorbachev, who was a journalist, and he was the head of the Crimean branch of the Russian Union of Journalists. And he told me when this war began, he thought that Ukraine should be a sovereign state, that the Ukrainian people deserved to have their own country. But he said, now I don't feel that anymore. I don't see that as a viable option, because that country, based on everything that I can see, will be an existential threat. That through its alliance with NATO to the Russian Federation for years to come. I don't agree with him. I think it's entirely possible for the Ukrainian people to have a sovereign, prosperous country that is at peace. I strongly believe that. But what I found striking about that conversation was this man admitted to me that he's been radicalized. This is what we're doing. We think we're causing the Russian people to want to overthrow their government and prefer one that is like the government of Boris Yeltsin. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposite is happening. If anything, if they replace Putin, it's likely going to be with somebody who is a much more aggressive, much more assertive, and much more nationalist than Vladimir Putin has been. Our policy, in a nutshell, is insane. It's crazy. Now, what I heard was consistent with polling data. Now, this is a chart from the Levada Center, which is a premier Russian polling agency, often treated respectfully by the Western media. And they themselves, the management of this organization, are critical of Vladimir Putin. They have been for many years. And what their polling data shows is that approval for Putin has hovered between somewhere 60 to low 80s for some 20 plus years. Now, why might that be? Of course, propaganda undoubtedly has something to do with it. But we're being told it's just propaganda. There's no objectively credible reason why Russians would support this man. Well, I went to the website of the World Bank just to check out some basic socioeconomic parameters during the Putin era. This is showing poverty. This is from the World Bank. When Putin took over, poverty was in the range of 27% in Russia. By the end of 2021, it had fallen to about 12%. A massive reduction in poverty. This is showing the lifespan of the Russian people. Life expectancy at birth, again from the World Bank. This dip you see right here is in the heart of the Yeltsin era. It went down to about 64 years. Imagine that, a wealthy country like Russia, the average lifespan is 64. It then soared during the Putin era up to about 73. It dipped substantially during the pandemic, which we saw in a lot of other countries. But still, it was well above where it was during the Putin era. And it has recently recovered. It doesn't appear on this chart. I understand that it's back up around 73 years. This is the unemployment rate in Russia. That huge peak you see on the left was during the heart of the Yeltsin era. It then declined. It went up, it spiked during the financial crisis, which was true of every country in the world, but then it went back down. It's nearly at a record low level of some 4.3%. Now, I want you to consider, ladies and gentlemen, that this happened during a period when Russia was being pummeled by sanctions. And what's truly remarkable about this, yes, it is remarkable, is that throughout all of this, the Russian government has drastically improved the fiscal position of the government. The Russian government today, the state, has one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the world and has the lowest debt to GDP ratio of any major economy. And it's managed to improve these socioeconomic conditions and improve the fiscal position of the Russian government while having to cope with sanctions. So, am I here to tell you that the Russian government is saintly? Of course not. There's plenty you can criticize about the Russian government. You can criticize the Russian government on its attitude towards the LGBTQ community. Perfectly legitimate, forceful criticisms. You can do the same with respect to freedom of speech. You can do the same with respect to the climate crisis. It has been every bit as irresponsible in dealing with the climate crisis as our own governments have been. And there are other criticisms you can level against them. But it's not, it's not Obi-Wan Kenobi against Darth Vader. There's another side to the story. And we should be intelligent enough to understand that maybe, just maybe, there are some objectively credible, rational reasons for the fact that there are a lot of Russians who support their government. And if we don't take that into account, we shouldn't do this as a favor to Putin. We should do this because you can't have a rational and effective foreign policy that isn't based upon reality. It has to be based upon reality, and this is a reality. What I'm showing you here is a 1996 cover from Time magazine. This was just after Yeltsin had been elected in a very controversial election. And what you'll see here is it says, "Yanks to the rescue, the secret story of why American advisors helped Yeltsin win." Now imagine in 2016 on the cover of TASS or Pravda, some major Russian media outlet. It said, "Russians to the rescue, the secret story of how Russian advisors helped Trump win." What would the reaction have been, ladies and gentlemen? They were actually bragging about this back in the 90s. And remember, think about those statistics I just showed you about how the Russian people suffered during the Yeltsin era. I heard this over and over again talking to Russians. That man is held in universal contempt. He caused humiliation, pain. People told me stories about how there were syringes in their parks. They'd never seen that before because people had been plunged into substance abuse. That young ladies they knew were forced to go into prostitution. That there was rampant criminality, people being killed in the streets, gunfire all the time. These are the stories that I heard. I can't tell you whether they're true or not. But the socioeconomic statistics support that the Yeltsin era was a disaster for the Russian people, and we were bragging about putting that man in power. How do you think the Russians feel about that? And the last thing I'll say about the situation in Russia is the IMF recently came out with its predictions for economic growth, and it predicted that in the next 2 years, this year and 2024, the Russian economy will grow, albeit weakly, and that the German economy will contract, and that the British economy will contract even more. Now, ain't nobody imposing devastating sanctions on Germany or the UK, but we have put together a sanctions package which is designed to destroy the Russian economy, and yet the IMF is telling us that that economy is going to grow, but that the German and the UK economies are going to shrink. Why is that? Well, partly, that's because, it's partly, of course, due to massive neoliberal mismanagement. That has a lot to do with it. Utter incompetence, complete disregard for the interests of ordinary Germans and Brits. But it also has to do with the fact that the sanctions that we have imposed upon Russia have increased the cost of living for Europeans. Instead of buying relatively cheap Russian natural gas, the Germans are now buying very expensive LNG from the United States, which is also ecologically dirtier than Russian natural gas that's delivered by pipeline. And they've even increased in Germany, the supposedly green government, they've increased substantially their consumption of coal. This is the insanity of our sanctions regime, ladies and gentlemen. So, I'd like to finish this part, the third part of my presentation, by sharing with you some reflections from Russians that I spoke to. Over and over again, I concluded my conversations by asking if you had a message for people in the West, what would it be? And I chose three which I think are representative of what I've heard. First of all, Victoria, who's a humanitarian worker, the director of a refugee center in Sevastopol, said people should analyze the events that happened much earlier, and I believe she was referring to the coup in 2014. Not now, she said. And then she added, do what you think is right deep in your heart. And then I spoke to a man named Mikhail, who was a math professor in Moscow, but who was from the Donbass, left there in 2010 to pursue graduate studies in Moscow. His father is Russian, his mother is Ukrainian. His mother continues to live in the Donbass 10 kilometers from the front line. His older brother is there. He knows people who were killed fighting on the pro-Russian side in the Civil War prior to the invasion. And he said to me, one thing which doesn't appear on this page, he said to me, when I hear, not often, but I hear criticism of this war, I say to these people, do you want the Ukrainians to kill my mother? That's the way he views it. And then he went on, he said, people in the West should, quote, make up their own minds. They must imagine how their daughters and sons will live tomorrow if the West continues down this path. Everything that you Westerners do makes it seem as though you do not want to live tomorrow. I'm not here to tell you whether he's right or wrong. I'm just sharing with you what he had to say. And finally, a remarkable man I met, a 60-year-old volunteer soldier from the Donbass. I interviewed him in Yalta when I was in Crimea at a center for disabled children. And the reason why I interviewed him there is because his daughter is disabled. He has one daughter. And he and his wife last year, at which point he was 60 years old, had a conversation about whether he should go to the Donbass and help to defend the pro-Russian rebels who were there. And he explained that after speaking to his wife, he decided to do that, and he went and he served for 6 months, a few kilometers from the front line, and then he came back. And in the course at the end of my interview, he said this. He said, East or West people are the same. Sometimes we want to live in a better life in comparison with our neighbors. Envy is not a good trait. We should be glad for each other. If you live a better life in the USA or Europe, we are happy for you. I'm a patriot of my country, but I remember back in the Soviet days, we envied people in the West as they lived a better life. Now Russia is rising, and others envy that we live a better life now. We do not want a neighbor next door who will have a stone in his pocket to throw at us. And then he got up after he said this to me, and he bowed and he apologized. And I said, why are you apologizing? And he said, I feel that my language was very undiplomatic. And this was an experience I had over and over again in Russia. Of course, there are people in the Russian government and Russian society who say terrible things. But the people I interacted with on the whole were remarkably friendly and remarkably diplomatic. Yes, it takes some courage to say this today, ladies and gentlemen, but it's shameful that it does. The Russian people are our brothers and sisters, just as the Ukrainian people. They're all brothers and sisters. And I found it quite troubling that I don't hear this kind of diplomacy coming from my fellow citizens when they talk about Russians. This kind of gentleness, this kind of apologetic, humble nature. This is something that we need to relearn in our society. We need to relearn the language of diplomacy if we're going to solve this existentially dangerous war. So finally, I'm going to quickly tell you what I think a peace deal might look like. And thank you for your patience. Before I do that, I just want to point out that for over 30 years I've been a lawyer, and that doesn't make me fallible by any means, but it is something that is instructive vis-a-vis dispute resolution, because what I did as a lawyer was I was a litigator. And fundamentally what litigators do is they represent combatants in a jurisprudential source, in a conflict that is ultimately a zero-sum game. There's going to be a winner and a loser if you go all the way to the courtroom, and that's the ultimate battlefield where a judge decides. But usually what happens in litigation is somewhere along the way the parties decide, you know, there's a range of possible outcomes here, and I don't really want to roll the dice on what the judge is going to say and take the chance that I end up with nothing, financial ruin, and the other side ends up with everything. So they sit down at the table and they work out a compromise. That's what I've been doing for over 30 years. And I think that there are some lessons from that experience that are applicable in all dispute contexts. One of them is you need to know who the true counterparties are. In other words, who are the true decision makers? Do we really believe that the Ukrainian government, which is dependent for its very existence on Western support, is the only decision maker on the Ukrainian side? Or do we think that probably the American government and its Western allies are going to have a big say in when this thing is going to be settled, and if so, on what terms? I happen to try to be realistic. I don't believe that the Americans are sending tens of billions of dollars of weaponry and economic aid without extracting their pound of flesh. They are almost certainly saying, don't you settle on terms that we will not support. And in fact, there are reports that they did exactly that in March of last year when the Russians and the Ukrainians were reportedly on the verge of a peace deal. The second thing I've learned in the course of my career is that in negotiations, people posture. Nobody who has any sense will enter a negotiation telling you what their bottom line is. Okay, the bottom line is something they keep to themselves and they share with their close advisors. They'll do everything they can to prevent you from knowing what their bottom line is. They come into the negotiation bidding high, expecting to be negotiating down, and they will try to end up with a result that is as far above their bottom line as possible. So what does this mean? This means what the Russians are telling us now, they require as terms of resolution, is a bid. It's an opening bid. Probably they're prepared to compromise. And the only way to find out is to sit down at the table with them and start negotiating. And the final thing is, and I touched upon this already, is that we cannot achieve a negotiated resolution without a change in tone. And I think a dramatic example of the idiocy of our side when it comes to diplomatic discourse is the recent visit of Antony Blinken to Beijing. The U.S. Secretary of State was packed off to Beijing to try to make nice with the Chinese because things are getting a little bit out of control. And he spent something like 30 hours meeting with a range of Chinese officials, and although it was a very difficult trip for Mr. Blinken, the reports were that he actually made some progress. And then that clown that buffoon Biden, some 2 or 3 days later, announced to the whole world that he thinks that Xi Jinping is a dictator. Now, you may think that Xi Jinping is a dictator. I don't believe that. But fine, you want to take that position. Don't delude yourself into thinking that you can have peace with China if you're going to use that kind of language. It's just not going to happen. We have to learn to speak the language of respect. We've lost the ability to do that. And the other thing I want to say about the West negotiating position is that Mr. Zelensky keeps saying there will be no negotiation at all until Russia withdraws all of its forces from the areas that we regard as Ukrainian, which includes Crimea. Okay, you can take that position, but don't tell me that you're serious about negotiating if that's your position, because there's absolutely zero prospect of the Russians withdrawing all of their forces, which is the main source of their leverage in the negotiations, before there's even a negotiation. It ain't gonna happen. It ain't gonna happen because not only would they lose their leverage in the negotiation, but also there are reasons to believe that the military of the Ukrainian forces will come in and will exact retribution on anybody who is perceived to have been cooperative or collaborative with the Russians. If you really care about those people...
That hasn't already happened?
It has. It has. There has already been retribution.
It has happened.
Excuse me, we did ask. Keep it quiet, please.
I'm happy to answer your question.
I'm getting, okay.
Well,
Yeah,
you can get
you'll
your
have your
but you
chance,
get
sir.
an opportunity to have your say.
And by the way, I just want to point out, it needs to be repeated. I know that what I'm saying to you here is difficult for you to hear, but what I'm saying to you here is completely absent from the mainstream media. People who feel the way you feel, I'm making a guess here about how you feel, sir, you get your voices heard in the mainstream media all the time. We deserve our opportunity to be heard as well. That's all I'm saying. And I don't deny for 1 second that there have been atrocities committed by Russian forces. I also think there have been atrocities committed by the Ukrainian forces. And you can consult Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International if you trust those organizations to determine that for yourself. I don't purport to know who's committed what atrocities. I don't purport to know who's done worse. War makes monsters out of men. Makes complete monsters out of them. I doubt there's been a war in all of human history where there weren't rampant war crimes. Our destruction, the U.S. government's destruction of Nagasaki and Hiroshima during the Good War, World War II, was one of the worst atrocities in human history, and nobody was held accountable for it. So I don't deny for 1 second that there have been war crimes committed all over that battlefield. But that's a reason to bring it to an end, not to intensify it. So I'm going to deal with the three, what I regard as the three principal demands of the Russian Federation. And this comes from a speech that was delivered by the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia earlier this year, and it was shared with me by this person that I met with at the Russian Foreign Ministry. First of all, Ukraine's neutral and non-aligned status, its refusal to join NATO and the EU. Okay, so first thing I want to say about this is I hear all the time that Ukraine has a right to join NATO. No, it doesn't have a right to join NATO. In fact, we are seeing right now, in the case of Turkey and Sweden, that any single NATO state has the right, under the Treaty of NATO, to veto the admission of a new member. How does anybody looking and reading, the NATO treaty in an objective manner come to the conclusion that any country that is not a member of NATO has a quote-unquote right to join NATO? And not only does Ukraine, and it's not just Ukraine, no non-NATO member has a right to join NATO, okay? Not only does not have a right, but we did make a promise. Our governments promised Gorbachev that they would not expand eastward after the reunification of Germany, and leading luminaries from the U.S. foreign policy establishment, like William Perry, the defense minister under Clinton, like George Kennan, in an interview with the New York Times in the late 90s, all said that expanding NATO eastward would be highly provocative, extremely dangerous, and would end in catastrophe. Okay, and we ignored them. The other thing I would say to the Ukrainian people, our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, be careful what you wish for. Do you really want to be a member of NATO? Really? You want to sacrifice your sovereignty, surrender your sovereignty to some general in Washington and the people in the White House? You want to be constantly badgered into spending 2% of your GDP on merchants of death when you have poor people in your country and your healthcare system needs to be reinforced and we have a climate crisis on our hands? Because that's what NATO is, ladies and gentlemen. It's a mafia. Rather than expanding NATO, we should be arguing for the dissolution of NATO. We should be getting out of NATO. And finally, a neutral Ukrainian buffer between Russian forces and NATO forces is a good thing. Do we really want two sides, each of which has the capacity to destroy the world many times over, separated by a few kilometers across a tense, fragile border? Or would we rather have them separated by as great a distance as possible? And people will say, well, you know, what's going to happen to Ukraine then? Well, look what happened to Austria, and look what happened to Finland, and Sweden, and Switzerland. They all chose the course of neutrality. They were all prosperous countries with robust trade relations with the West. None of them was attacked by Russia. We actually provoked this war by expanding NATO. There would have been a much less belligerent situation in Ukraine if we had not insisted on this suicidal course of action, which, as so many people in the US foreign policy community acknowledged, was going to end in disaster. The second demand, recognition by Kiev and the international community of its new territorial realities. That's what the Russians are saying. And this is, I believe, the most contentious and difficult demand. We're talking now not only about Crimea, we're also talking about 4 oblasts in the southeast of Ukraine: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. The Russian Federation is purported to have annexed those 4 oblasts on top of Crimea, and they're telling us that we must accept the new territorial realities. Now, as a lawyer, what I find interesting is they keep using this phrase, new territorial realities. They don't actually ever come out and say, at least I'm not aware of it, that you have to recognize our annexation of the entirety of each one of these oblasts. And that's important because they don't actually control them all. So they only control, at the current time, something in the range of 60% of Kherson. Okay, they don't control all of any of these oblasts. And I think, I could be wrong, but the reason why the Russians are using this ambiguous phrase, new territorial realities, is to leave themselves some room for negotiation and compromise. But I think it's fair to say, again, I'm just trying to be realistic here, that at this stage of the game, there will be no negotiated settlement that does not involve some territorial concessions of some kind. You know, I'm not advocating for these. I'm just telling you what I think is the reality. Do you want peace or don't you? If you want peace, you have to accept that this is just going to have to be done. So the question then becomes, if you want peace, what is the best way to do this? What is the most just and peaceful way and durable way to do this? I think the way to do this is in a manner that's consistent with a fundamental human right that we call the right to self-determination. Let the people decide. Now, there have been referenda in Crimea and in the 4 southeastern oblasts, but there are legitimate criticisms to be made about those referenda. They were done in times of war. Okay, a lot of the people who voted in those referenda, or who would have voted or could have voted, had fled, and a substantial number of those people wanted to remain in Ukraine. So there are legitimate criticisms to be made. So the way you deal with this is to do an internationally supervised plebiscite, and that it be conducted on terms that are agreeable to both the Ukrainian and the Russian governments. And if we really believe in the human right of self-determination, which has been repeatedly acknowledged and endorsed by the UN General Assembly, then we should respect their decision. Why wouldn't we do that? Who are we to tell the people who live in these regions that they have to live under a Russian government or they have to live under a Ukrainian government? That's a decision for them to make in the most democratic manner possible, and we should support that. And by the way, because I get asked this a lot, my position is exactly the same with respect to Quebec, where I live. If the people of Quebec said, we want to have our own country, I would respect their decision. And if I wasn't prepared, to live in that country, I would be, if they made that decision, then I'd leave. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to deprive the people of Quebec or any people of their right to self-determination, and nor should we. And finally, the third, I think, principal demand, the one that seems to get people most worked up when we talk about the demands of the Russian Federation, is this concept of denazification. Now, there's some people who say, I've seen this argument a lot, that when the Russians say denazification, what they're saying basically is that everybody in Ukraine is a Nazi, and that we got to get rid of all the Nazis, and if you add up that formula, what it leads to is genocide. Okay? I think there's another interpretation. There's a range of interpretations you could put on this word denazification, and the only way to find out what they really mean by it is to sit down at the table and talk to them. Now, if I were talking to them, okay, I don't know what they mean by this. I've never seen a clear statement by the Russian Federation government about what they mean by denazification. I'd throw a proposal on the table and see where this leads. First of all, that the Ukrainian government annul the national holiday in favor of Stepan Bandera. Why would anybody disagree with that? Secondly, that the Ukrainian government dismantle and disarm the neo-Nazi battalions in the Ukrainian military and security services. Why would anybody disagree with that? And finally, that the Ukrainian government launch an educational program in its schools to teach young Ukrainians about the truth relating to Stepan Bandera and his odious legacy. So, for example, something we should be doing in this country, and I understand that some parts of the country have started to do this, is to tell our young people about the reality of Sir John A. Macdonald, this racist white supremacist, this author of the residential school system. Why would we as Canadians object to educating young Ukrainians about the truth of Bandera? And now I have no idea whether the Russians would accept this. All I'm saying is, why not put out a proposal like that, not necessarily that one, but similar ones, and see where it leads in a discussion, which leads me to the final thing I want to say to you today. You know, we're being led to believe that it's an unpardonable sin to advocate for peace and to oppose the constant escalation of this war. I say to you, my friends, that the one unpardonable sin is for peace to be in front of you and not to try.
Yeah, right on.
That's unforgivable.
Well, thank you, Dimitri, and I did say we're going to go into a question and answer period, but just prior to that, somebody's going to come up. Ken, who is this? It's going to do a little bit of a fundraiser.
That's
Jason, okay, so obviously we have to pay for this facility and so on, and I know it's not a great part of the meeting, but Jason, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you. It's easy following Dimitri. It's not actually. It's quite intimidating. Look, there's a brother right there with the shirt on that says he's already against the next war. And I am already against the next war because I know that the people that ran the pandemic in the West, that the people that ran the banking crash, and that the people that have led the war in Afghanistan, and Iraq, and the NATO powers, that they are already planning the next war. And I am against that war. We, as Dimitri said, need to have a war against poverty, a war against unemployment, a war against racism, a war against genocide against the indigenous peoples of America, and a war, the Americas rather, and a war against climate injustice. And these are the only struggles that we really have. The world is in deep crisis. This is the worst it's been in decades. And I do know, on the good, looking at the positive side of things, is that there was a very difficult period after the war in Afghanistan when it started after 9/11. There was widespread hysteria and support for that war. But over a course of time, people became conscious politically. Without there even being political parties that were speaking out against the war, people on their own accord started to draw the conclusions that the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan were failed ventures. And that is the dominant ideology right now among ordinary people in the West right now, and obviously in the underdeveloped world, in the third world. That people view these wars as what they were, naked wars to rob the third world of its resources and to establish puppet governments for the pro-NATO powers. So on that basis, we have to build a powerful anti-war movement. This is the first step in Toronto. We've been trying to be silenced. We will not accept the silence. We will mobilize against the war. Kiri, is Kiri here? He's going to hand around some cards for you to sign up and to so that we can build an anti-war coalition. We'd like to thank Hamilton Stop the War Coalition for organizing this event. And that I'm incredibly confident that if we build a coalition to stop the war in the city of Toronto, we can start collaborating with other people in the country and start to change the political discourse in this country as our contribution. If we can start pushing back the war effort, we can start changing society as a whole. That's what we need to do. So we ask you to help financially and to sign up and help join the Anti-War Coalition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So we're going to move into the question and answer period. The brother here has got a microphone. He's going to be able to move around the hall. Anna, did you say you had a microphone too? You didn't?
Well, there's that, and there's that one there.
Okay, well, this one's a short one, so...
Yeah.
So anyways...
Dimitri can maybe use that one to answer
Exactly,
questions.
you got it, you got it. So we did say we would go to the sister at the back here as the first question, so the floor is yours.
Yeah, so here, what I will do is... just I'm going to be able to move around, so this makes the most sense, I think, for me to do this. It'd be better if we had a...
I wanted to know why you spoke to the people in Russia. You have lots of people there, and I want to know why you can do that.
Why I went to Russia at all, or why I spoke to those particular people? Yeah, because first and foremost, they are, like all peoples, our brothers and sisters, and we should have a dialogue with them. Secondly, their country has enough nukes to destroy the world many times over, and I'm deeply concerned about the future of my children. And finally, all we hear about in the Western media are the anti-Russian voices, and particularly people who are critics of the Russian Federation. And I'm glad we hear about them. We hear their voices, and we should hear their voices, but there's no discussion about alternative voices. And what I wanted to do was to try to introduce some balance into the public discourse, because right now I believe it's completely imbalanced. So I didn't go to Russia focusing on speaking to people who condemn Putin. If people had come to me and done that, I would report to you what I heard. But my focus was on hearing from the majority of Russians who, by all accounts, actually support their government and try to understand why.
For people who want to ask a question, please just raise your hand and I'll get to you. Thank you. And if I seem to have missed you, just put your hand up again. And so who's the gentleman who wanted to? Okay, sure.
So, Dimitri, thank you very much for a marvelous presentation. So something has happened in Canada in the past couple of weeks that was a one-day wonder in the news, but I'd like to know your reaction to it. If you drive by the airport right now, you will see this massive, beautiful-looking airplane with a Russian flag on it. It arrived in Canada in the early days of the pandemic, bringing emergency pandemic supplies. It's owned by some private individuals. It's not even clear who they are. And the Canadian government has now said that they're just going to grab it. And I'd just like to know, I mean, you're a trained lawyer. What do you think of that?
Great question. I actually saw that massive jet myself when I was flying from Toronto to Winnipeg on this tour. It was quite a strike. It almost seemed like they put it in a place that was prominent so they could just shove it in the face of the Russians. Look, if our government was even remotely consistent in the way it approached, alleged violations of international law. So, for example, if it was seizing the assets of the Israeli apartheid state and Israeli oligarchs who fund, war crime settlements in the West Bank, if it was, seizing the assets of Saudi autocrats who had profited from a genocide in Yemen, if it was doing these kinds of things, then, at least it could say it was being consistent and had taken an approach that is designed to achieve justice and they were applying human rights law universally. But it's so selective and it's so biased that this looks like naked theft. It's just naked theft. And what they're actually doing is, number one, arousing the already very heightened resentment of the global south towards our rank, disgusting hypocrisy. And they're also undermining confidence in the global financial system, which is based upon the US dollar hegemony. And that's leading to a movement away from US dollar hegemony, which ultimately is going to be devastating to the United States. I think this is a very ill-advised policy, especially given how discriminatorily it's applied.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Well, actually, I wanted to add a little bit and then ask a question, if I may. Because you say you were born in the 60s. I was born in the 30s. So, I was a child at the bombing of London. And I don't know whether anyone can imagine how terrible that is, never knowing something's coming down on your head. I remember sleeping in a bunk bed below my parents. My father was a doctor, and there were things called doodlebugs. They were bombs that were planes. They didn't have anyone flying them. They were actual bombs, and they whined. And if they whined just above you, if that's the whine stopped, you knew you were all right. You would count 50, and then you'd hear the crash. And I remember my father saying, those poor people, those poor people. And you just have to imagine. In fact, my husband was Greek, and he was in the resistance in Greece during the So that's what I want to say. And what I want to say right now, it is terrifying, because I remember the atom bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I remember hearing about the Bikini Islands, where the people were moved because they wanted to do tests, and they thought they'd come back in 2 weeks. Well, they didn't come back. They'll never be able to come back. The whole place is absolutely ruined with radiation. So we have to stop this. I'm very frightened of a nuclear war. And I think, yes, we all have to, besides writing to our governments and people, all of us who are members of climate change movements, I think, ask all of those people. We've got to stop it, because now the Americans are giving cluster bombs to the Ukrainians. These are the most evil thing you can imagine. It's a bomb that explodes, and all sorts of little bombs come flying out. And it's quite terrible. So we have to do everything, we have to stop it. Now the question is, I just wanted to ask you, what more can we do, and what is the UN doing? Because the UN is there to stop this sort of thing.
Thank you for sharing that experience. I think part of the problem we have in the West is that there are fewer and fewer people who actually live through those horrors in the West. And we forgot just how unspeakably terrible war actually is.
Yes.
Especially on the scale that was fought during the Second World War. And I would love to talk to anybody who served as a resistance fighter in the Second World War in Greece. Not too many of them I've met in my lifetime, so I'm happy to speak to your husband. In terms of what the UN is doing, I think the UN is a failure. I think it was a concept that was extraordinarily positive, and that it had enormous potential, but the way we structured the United Nations, which is that we gave a veto power to a handful of states, and it is, as I understand it, the US that has employed the veto power by far more than any other permanent member of the UN Security Council, that this is a fundamentally flawed organization. And the fact that it disproportionately dependent upon the United States government for its funding, because one always pays the piper at the end of the day, skews its leadership's attitude towards international conflicts, towards the position that's favored by the US government. So we're in a perilous position where the only, I hope I'm wrong, but I think the only realistic prospect we have in the West for altering our governance policies is through civil disobedience. You know, and I love to recount a story that I learned from Chris Hedges, which he read in the memoir of Kissinger, where at the height of the the Vietnam War, where they had surrounded the White House with empty buses as barricades, and tens of thousands of irate protesters were clamoring to get beyond the buses. According to Kissinger, Nixon, who was standing beside him in the White House, looked at him and said, "Henry, they're coming to get us." And then some months later, Nixon brought the war to an end. they need to feel that kind of fear in their hearts, unfortunately. And I think with every passing day, they're becoming so politically invested in this that they can't conceive, unless they're forced, they can't conceive of a diplomatic outcome. So it's a very dangerous moment, and I think we really have to take matters into our own hands, albeit peacefully.
First, I like to start with a comment and then ask my question. Today actually coincides with a peace wave hosted by World Beyond War. And as a Christian, I don't believe in coincidences, and the gospel talks about blessed are the peacemakers. So I want to have my blessings on you and the many brave voices who speak out for peace. I would like to ask a question pertaining to trying to understand our fellow brothers and sisters. You spoke to many people in Russia. Now, I imagine if you were to go to Ukraine, you may hear many heartbreaking stories if you acknowledge the atrocities on the Ukrainian side as well as the Russian side. How do you explain, I guess, to the average person in Ukraine who is invested in their homeland, defense of their values, their families, that negotiating for peace is the best way forward if they want to live a life of prosperity for them and their future generations? After all, we in the West live relatively comfortable, apart from conflict in Toronto, where there's no bombs going off, thankfully. But somebody who lives in Ukraine and is emotionally invested and experiences great loss and may have men on the front lines, how do you explain to them why diplomacy is necessary to end this conflict? Or how would you go about doing that without being very, how do I say this, condescending to their perspective?
You know, I have to tell you, because a number of my speaking events, our brothers and sisters from the Ukrainian community have showed up, and they've said some very bad things about me. You know, in Montreal, I was constantly, bombarded while I was speaking in the park because our venue canceled on us under pressure at the last minute with claims that I'm a fraud and a liar and a fascist. And I keep reminding myself exactly of what you just said, which is what's happening in Ukraine is absolutely horrible. People are losing members of their family. I can't really blame the Ukrainian people for being very, very upset.
Yeah.
So I just want to start by saying I completely understand their passion and their anger and why they're upset with me. And these are very difficult conversations, and all I can do is talk about the evidence. Talk about, for example, the evidence of U.S. government duplicity. Do the Ukrainian people, based on the historical record, really believe that Joe Biden is looking out for their interests? Is that plausible? Or is it plausible, more plausible, much more plausible, I would say, that what Joe Biden is doing is he's trying to maximize Russian suffering at any cost to the Ukrainian people, and is consciously pursuing a course of action that will very likely end in the destruction of Ukraine, but he hopes will fatally weaken Russia. I think based on the historical record, that is a much more plausible interpretation of what he's doing. We can see how the United States government left Libya, left Iraq, left Afghanistan in smoking ruins. And to our brothers and sisters in the Ukrainian people, I want you to think about the evidence in this very difficult moment in your national history and ask yourselves, what do you think your allies, your supposed allies, are really up to? Is it plausible that they're ultimately looking out for your best interests? I don't think it is. And we have to find a way to have these conversations, calmly and with mutual respect. But to me, that's the only way to overcome the emotion and the passion of the moment, which is completely understandable, is to talk about the historical record.
Sorry,
It's up to, I'm going to leave this up to whoever's. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So basically, as Canadians, the only government we can really influence is the Canadian government. And even assuming that's possible with the cast of characters that we have, what do you think? Let's assume that we had actually decent people in Ottawa. What would the American government do to a Canadian government that stepped out of line.
There'd be hell to pay. I mean, no doubt about it. Look, I wrote an article. The last time the mainstream media allowed me to say anything on their pages was the Hill Times, and it was an op-ed that I wrote about the Biden administration and how everybody was celebrating Biden's victory over Trump, when all indications were that this man was really no better than Trump at the end of the day, and might even be, God forbid, worse than the reality TV shows. He arguably is worse. And at any event, what I was trying to explain in that article is that our governments, successive conservative liberal governments, over the course of decades, have created a level of dependency on the US economy that makes it very difficult for us to exercise any degree of sovereignty. Not just in terms of foreign policy, but even in terms of domestic policy. And that we need to diversify our relationships politically and economically and move away from US dependence in order to be able to exercise our sovereignty. Right now, we're extraordinarily vulnerable to US government retribution because of our dependence on the US economy. I understand this is a very difficult situation. So the first step, it seems to me, is we need to extract ourselves from the situation. When I was a law student at the University of Toronto, back in the 80s, they were debating then whether we should enter into NAFTA at all. I remember that. That was a highly controversial subject. Now nobody thinks there's anything wrong with ever deepening economic relations with the United States. We've been propagandized into thinking that this codependency, and ultimately codependency with this behemoth means dependency. We've been propagandized into thinking this is economically and socially beneficial. It's a disaster for Canada. We have no more sovereignty. So I have no illusions about how difficult it would be for Canada to plot an independent course. This is a decades-long process that's going to require a complete rethinking of our economic model and our trade relationships.
Thank you very much. Dimitri, thank you very much. My name is Barry. I'm with Socialist Action, one of the promoters of this meeting. And I want to reiterate a point that was made just in passing at the beginning. This meeting is a victory for free speech. Despite efforts to block it by right-wing Ukrainian nationalists and by failed mayoral candidate and city councillor Brad Bradford, who went to the internet to declare that the Toronto Public Library system should be ashamed for allowing this meeting to take place here, this meeting is taking place and is a resounding success. And we all want to thank Dimitri for visiting Russia and for reporting on his findings. Who is afraid of free speech? Opponents of the truth about the origins of the current conflict. Opponents of peace through negotiations. Apologists for NATO, for the war industry, for big oil and gas. That's who is afraid of free speech. We need to uphold free speech. And my organization upholds free speech while we support neither side in the war. We say that the prime enemy is at home. We demand that Justin Trudeau stop funding the war machine, stop rewarding NATO expansion. We say Canada out of NATO, and we say to Jagmeet Singh, break with the Liberal NDP Confidence and Supply Pact, because you are complicit in this war. So my question is this. Since the Kremlin is no ally of women, LGBTQI people, independent labor unions, or the anti-war movement that we need to build, I would like you to offer your view as to what happened recently in the military mutiny in Russia. My question is, why did Putin hire mercenary soldiers led by Yevgeny Prigozhin and others in the first place? And should we demand the release of anti-war prisoners on both sides?
Okay, there's a few questions in there. And all of which are difficult, because we all have limited information. My understanding as to why Wagner was created is because there were foreign conflicts in which the Russian Federation's government wanted to play a role, but wanted to be able to distance itself from military intervention. And which is the same reason why you see private military companies all over the West. You know, you see these kinds of structures, for example, the French Foreign Legion, Blackwater in the United States and so forth. And I'm not saying that this is an excuse. I'm just explaining the phenomenon. This has now become generalized, and it's an extremely dangerous phenomenon of privately owned armies. We should not allow this at all. And I think this what happened with Prigozhin is an abject lesson in how dangerous this is. Because that man became so powerful and influential that he could have overthrown the Russian state, caused a civil war. In terms of what actually happened, I think that Prigozhin, he's become a billionaire as a result of not only being the titular head of Wagner and a part owner of Wagner, but also because Wagner had some and his organization, his business empire had some very lucrative contracts with the Russian military, like feeding the soldiers. And so I think that the Russian government, during the Battle of Bakhmut, and particularly when the Bakhmut bloodbath was successfully concluded by Russia, they took control of Bakhmut. They realized that Prigozhin was now too big for his britches, and he needed to be disempowered. And so what they did was they said to Prigozhin's men, you have a choice. You can disarm, or you can sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Effectively, they were going to fold the Wagnerites into the Russian military and deprive Prigozhin of control over this private army. And so Prigozhin at the 11th hour, this was going on for months after Bakhmut fell, behind the scenes, and it exploded into public view when finally Prigozhin, this is my interpretation, I could be completely wrong, but that this was a desperation move, a Hail Mary, to try to pressure the government of the Russian Federation into letting him keep his private army. I don't think he ever really believed, my guess is that he never really believed he was going to get all the way to the Red Square in the Kremlin. Certainly not intact, but I think that he basically bluffed, he gambled, and he lost. That's the best read that I have on the situation. Having said that, it's a bit early to say. You know, we'll have to see how all of this unfolds, but there was a raid in the last 2 days of Prigozhin's business headquarters in, I think, St. Petersburg, and the Russian government published some pretty interesting videos of what they purportedly found there. So I don't think this story's over, and it's one we should watch carefully.
Hello, thank you very much. First, I want to say it takes a lot of effort, obviously, to go and do all the interviews, and thanks for sharing them at this presentation. I'm all for peace, and I also do believe in balancing between the ideal and the real. And I just wanted to ask a question to get more information. So let's say we are at the negotiation table, and you explained a bit about what the Russian side might want. Maybe I missed it, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think would be what the West is looking for? Like, what is really the motive behind what they're doing? Is it, also they're not also the Darth Vader? Is it just a greedy group trying to expand? Who are the source of it? Like for me, as a Canadian citizen, actually currently living in US, I don't really find it, I don't care whether NATO gets bigger or not. So who is it that's caring? What are they caring about? If you could just dig deeper into what is motivating the West, who are the actual people and what do they want?
Well, I think we go back to the demise of the Soviet Union. I think the United States government found itself in a position that was without precedent in all of human history. It was a global empire, an unchallenged global empire. It wasn't simply, you look at the British Empire, the Roman Empire, these were not empires of global scope. The US government found itself in a truly extraordinary position of hegemony. And there's a really interesting and telling speech that Wesley Clark, who I believe was the NATO Secretary General he was the top general for NATO for some years, and I believe he sought the Democratic nomination to be President of the United States. And he talks about this, this incident where he was in the bowels of the Pentagon and he ran to, I think it was Wolfowitz, I could be wrong about this, and it was some neocon, some bloodthirsty neocon from the 90s, who told him, basically we got about 10 to 20 years to disempower all the governments in the world that pose an obstacle to our hegemony. And he lined them off. Syria, Libya, Iraq, Somalia, or And every one of them is a government that was ultimately attacked by the United States government. And he said, we basically got to get this done because, sooner or later, the Russians and the Chinese are going to be back to a considerable level of strength economically and militarily, and will no longer be able to dominate the world. So we got to nip that one in the bud. That tells you all you need to know. This is about the United States government finding itself in this extraordinary position of global hegemony after the demise of the Soviet Union, and deciding, at the highest levels of the US government, that this was a position that they were not going to surrender under any circumstances, and they were going to do everything they could to preserve their position of power. And we've watched this unfold in the last 30 years, and now we're on the brink of disaster because of it. If there is a Darth Vader in this, it is the people, not one person, but the people who control US foreign policy. They're not acting in the interest of the American people. It's not the American people who are responsible for this. It's a group of extraordinarily powerful people in the Pentagon and the National Security State and the White House. And frankly, they're leading us down the path of destruction. I think it's as simple as that. Power is a very strong motivator. And people do terrible things in order to acquire and maintain their power.
I have a question about the economy, not exactly what is going on in Ukraine, because people know what is going on there. So it's a proxy war, it will never end. So I've been following the guy in the US online, it's called Douglas McGregor. It's a former US general. Yeah, this guy is really, really
Sorry,
good.
who's that?
Douglas McGregor.
McGregor, yeah.
It's really, really good. So I believe he used to work for former President Donald Trump. So I listened to a few of his speeches online. So, but my focus is on China actually. So the alliance between China and Russia on the cover, on the big table, we don't pay attention to that. And the position of Canada regarding China, the last 5 years, remember like Canadian diplomat were arrested, something like that in China. So we have some speeches about China that are very, very wrong. So if you're going back to the 1990s, China is not anymore a communist country. So people don't know about the economy, they don't know about the banking system, so they speak wrongfully about China. China is one of the biggest capitalist countries in the world. We have to know that. China take all Western countries, factories, and manufacturers. Myself, I was born in the Caribbean, in Haiti. I remember in the early 1990s, now I'm 47. So my aunties used to go to work in factories for garments that must have, ship them to the US, right? So the island was good enough. So with Clinton administration, they destroy everything. The US big corporation took all these factories in the Caribbean and the Central American countries. They outsourced them all to China. So when poverty comes, and then illegal immigration started. You understand what I'm trying to say? So my question is about the positions of some new conservative about China. So now I see the way they approach in Thailand, like the Philippines, Taiwan, and I'm pretty sure the US, they don't give a damn about the Taiwanese people. They same about the Ukraine. Okay? They care about what they need. They work with the concept of Germany. This is what the Americans care about. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So now my question, China, if you look the history of the Chinese, they never really fight war out of China. So the Chinese are not the way our leaders are explaining to us the Chinese. Myself, I don't understand the Chinese. Okay?
You don't?
I don't really understand the Chinese. Okay, my question is, so now, imagine our dollar, the Canadian dollar, we do business with the Americans. We depend on the US. You have to accept that. So you see the BRICS, and then China and the South Africa, all these countries, they're trying to get their own currency to do business. It will work. You show that on your own with your map.
Can you get to the
My question is, what do you think about that? About the economy? Because we have a standard of living, we don't care about the war. But by the time we don't get that US dollars, what we gonna do? How are we going to support our economy? We don't have manufacturers, only services. What we gonna do?
First of all, I don't believe that the Chinese economy is a purely capitalist economy. I think it's a mixed economy. So, for example, there's a much higher degree of state, as I understand it, of state ownership of essential enterprises in China. And if you look at the hundreds of millions of people who have been lifted out of poverty under this system, it's hard to make the case that this is a purely capitalist system. It's what it's achieved in terms of quality. So, I think that's important to just underscore. But it is absolutely true that China is now an industrial manufacturing behemoth, and that we have been largely deindustrialized here. This is a major, major problem. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. We need to restructure our economy in this country. It's not just about diversifying our trade relationships. We need to nationalize industries that are necessary to the well-being of Canadians, and we need to rebuild industries that we've gutted. For example, we used to have our own pharmaceutical manufacturer, Connaught Labs, world class. We privatized it. So we had to go to US-based pharmaceutical companies to bail us out of the pandemic at extraordinary cost. And we've seen countries like Cuba, which have their own pharmaceutical industry and far less money than we do. They were able to develop their own vaccine and weren't dependent here upon Western countries. So we need to restructure our economy. And, we don't do that. We're going down with the US.
Some patient folks over here.
Is the microphone working?
It is, yeah.
It does.
You don't think it's loud enough, maybe?
All right, sure. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Dimitri for the presentation. I think you've laid out some very basic facts about the situation in the Ukraine and about the conflict that are not debatable. The government in Ukraine did come to power through a coup. What preceded Zelensky came to power through a coup, which was basically financed by U.S. imperialists. And that government proceeded to abolish a law recognizing minority language rights in the country, which provoked a civil war, right? The Poles, the Hungarians, and especially the Russians in the East did not feel like they were part of this country anymore. And you can see that today, right? Like the Party of Regions has been banned amongst a bunch of other political parties in Ukraine. So I guess my question is, we recognize that this is a war largely spearheaded by NATO against the Ukraine, against Russia fundamentally, and the Russian military, first semi-covertly but now overtly, are basically fighting to, as you said in the 3 demands, denazify Ukraine, force neutrality, and protect the right of self-determination of the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. My only question is, why would you not support the Russian military to force a negotiated settlement with the government that clearly has no interest in the rights of its own population, but I mean, now that we're seeing that the Americans are introducing depleted uranium munitions and the cluster bombs, which are notoriously anti-civilian weapons. Like, there's no way that this represents the interests of the Ukrainians, and I think that when asked about the introduction of cluster munitions, the the response by the Pentagon is that the victory against the Russians is more important than the, fate of, or the civilian casualties in Ukraine. So, I mean, it's been said that the Americans are willing to let every Ukrainian die to fight the Russians. I mean, why do not? So the question is, how can we achieve a negotiated settlement without basically a victory by the Russian military?
I just don't support a military solution to any problem. And just to highlight that, people in this room, many of you will know, the first time I got in trouble was not the Ukraine war, it was my advocacy for Palestinians. And smeared by the Prime Minister and the leaders of the opposition because I criticized two members of Parliament for being really fanatical supporters of Israel, which is an apartheid state. But that's another story. The issue of what I want to point out here is that I would not even support sending weapons to Palestinians. I've never taken that position, and in fact, because I've been told, well, your position's inconsistent. No, it's not inconsistent. I don't think we should send weapons to Palestinians. I think what would happen would be a bloodbath. Would the Palestinians manage to kill a lot more Israeli soldiers than they can now? Sure they would. And then the Israelis would respond with a massacre. I mean, they're willing to massacre them now when one or two Israeli soldiers. Imagine if they started killing thousands of Israeli soldiers, what would happen? This violence is not an answer. And the traditions of MLK and Gandhi and others teach us that much can be achieved through peaceful resistance. At great risk to ourselves, but much can be achieved. So I will always be faithful to that path. I'm not a militarist and I can't support any war. But what I will say is that we are putting the Russians in a position, in my opinion, where war is the only option for them. We're not giving them another option. When we say to them, you have to give up every inch of that territory, no matter what the people there want, whether or not they want to be part of Russia, and you have to offer up your leaders to be prosecuted for war crimes, even though American war criminals get off scot-free and Israeli war criminals get off scot-free. And you have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars reconstructing Ukraine, and we don't recognize any of your complaints as legitimate. And you know what? Just to shove it in your face, we're also going to make Ukraine a member of NATO once we defeat you. I mean, what option are we giving them other than war? And ultimately, they will win the war. Certainly, we're not going to defeat them. The best we can hope for is a stalemate that, as I said many times, will result in Ukraine's destruction. So, although I don't favor war, and I do not support any military effort by any country, I do say that we are leaving the Russians in no position other than the military option.
So I just have a couple more questions here.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, thanks, Dimitri. So, from the Campbells, by the way, in Jonah. Now, a story that the Campbells broke yesterday was around the privatization and the privatization drive in Ukraine. Now, what I've actually found through access to information, government documents, was that there was this program by the National, can you bring it up a little higher? National Judicial Institute, a Canadian organization, that was actually trying to influence how Ukrainian judges and judge trainees in particular viewed land law. And that was all around communal and state-owned property, because there wasn't scale of privatization in Ukraine in the same way that there was in other countries, say the Baltics, the post-Soviet nations. Now, what you would see actually is right after this coup, you immediately had major privatization drives begin. You had the creation of this tool called ProZorro, which was run by a Western funded organization. It was called Transparency International. Now, this tool, ProZorro.sale, it has over the years, according to Ukrainian journalists and economists, they've the sales have been 10% of the value of these original public lands. So it's very easily costing Ukrainians billions of dollars, maybe even trillions, if this continues in the coming years. And what this is now what's happening is that there's a Canadian aid program that ran for about 6 years, and it helped this ProZorro.sale initiative reach 16 Ukrainian cities just on its own, just because of that program. So my question to you is with this aid program, right? It started 2 years before the coup. There's this talk about, there's of course, the NATO plans for war on Russia for many a time, right? But do you think there's been a conscious war of aggression by NATO in the West against Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people well before the Maidan coup happened in 2014?
Monsanto bought all the best soil in Ukraine. Monsanto.
I thank you for pointing that out about the Monsanto, the big agro, and how it's exploiting the situation. Before there was this great interview that a Ukrainian sociologist gave, I believe it was to one of the Gray Zone journalists, which talked about the Zelensky record before the invasion. And when he was elected in 2019 on a peace platform and an anti-corruption platform, I believe he got 72% of the popular vote. And she pointed out that before the invasion, his popularity rating had fallen to something like 29%. It had absolutely plummeted. This was in the space of like a year and a half. And a big part of the reason for that was because Zelensky pursued a fanatically neoliberal program, just gutting labor rights, privatization up the wazoo on terms that were very unfavorable to the Ukrainian state. And it's only accelerated since the invasion. But those who think that the policies, the incredibly pro-corporate policies that he's pursuing now only originated after the invasion are not paying attention to the record. He was profoundly unpopular beforehand because he betrayed his fundamental commitment to pursue a program that was in the interests of ordinary Ukrainians. This man is, it's hard not to believe that somehow, by some way, they put him in power because they knew that ultimately he was going to do the bidding of the corporate sector in the West and the neocons in Washington, because that's all he's done from the first day he was elected.
Okay, so we're going to take 2 more questions. We've got to be out of here by 4:15. If people are really concise, we may be able to get in 3 questions.
Could you get this gentleman was trying to ask me a question.
Okay.
I don't need the microphone.
Well, will you do
I
it?
can project. Okay. And I've thought of a lot of things that I want to say, but I'll keep it brief.
Microphone indicates it's your turn. It's kind of like a talking stick. Okay. It indicates that it's your turn.
Okay. How do you negotiate with a bully?
Well, you could ask that question to Biden.
I'm asking you.
Yeah,
I'm
but
also
no, but this
asking
is-
you, right.
but this-
How do you
this-
negotiate
but
with
this
bullies?
is-
What
this is-
makes Putin less of a bully than Biden, for example, or Xi Jinping?
Okay, so sir, what I'm going to suggest to you is that this analogy or this characterization is not telling us the whole story. When you say that Vladimir Putin is a bully, that really doesn't tell us the
Any
story.
bully. How
What
do
you
you
have
negotiate
done,
with a bully?
but I'm telling you that that's
He's
sir.
spoken for an hour and a half.
Yeah, but you won't let me answer.
Let him answer
If you want to speak some more, go ahead, and then when you're done, I'll speak. If you're finished, then I'll speak. But all I ask is, if you're finished, let me finish my answer. Okay? As I tried to lay out here, I don't think you can say it's just a case of a bully and a victim. I think this is a war between NATO, which is the ultimate bully, and Russia, and that the Ukrainian people are being used as cannon fodder, and that if you take the view that Putin is a bully, and you can't negotiate with the man for that reason, not only are you disregarding the historical record, but you are also guaranteeing that we will pursue a course of action that will end in the destruction of Ukraine. That's my answer to you.
How did Vietnam?
One question what you say. So
Here's what I'll say.
Fuck off!
How about you fuck off?
Hey, whoa! You got a second to answer your second question, and then we'll move on.
Okay, I'll drop my second question and make a comment.
Sure.
Make it brief.
Okay. There are very few countries in the world, okay, that have given up voluntarily their status as nuclear powers. Ukraine is one of them. The main nuclear power in this conflict is Russia. The main nuclear power that will instigate a nuclear war is Russia. It won't be NATO. If it's NATO, it will be a response. NATO only responds when attacked. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you
Go
for
speak
coming.
at the Sudbury Nuclear Neutrino Lab.
Held at the Hiroshima. Okay, please.
You have a question?
Got a question here.
Okay, so quick comment then question. So the comment is, when all Western countries have funded war over diplomacy and peace, what results can anyone expect from those investments? And the question is, what is your opinion on how the media maintains the same narrative? Is there a directive that comes from the Canadian government, and how is this done? Is there a law that maintains this? Who in the Canadian and American governments maintain these cross-country communication narratives and otherwise known as talking points? Is there a law that requires Native members to follow these narratives?
You're talking about, did you say Native members?
Canada specific.
NATO members.
Canada, but by virtue of the situation, because we all see in the media, they're all saying the same thing. That's impossible anywhere.
Yeah.
Unless people are colluding together for a purpose. So how is that done? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, I can't offer any better insight than Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. I mean, they're brilliant analysis of the way the Western media system works, but there was a tremendously important, I can find the time to promote this on social media, an interview between Ray McGovern, some of you will know this, he served in the CIA for a long time, and Bob Scheer. It's on Scheer Post. I watched it. It's an hour and a half long. I can't recommend enough to you that you watch it. And he very simply, Ray McGovern, who was an advisor to Ronald Reagan, was deeply ensconced in the highest levels of the U.S. government during the Reagan era. He described how the media system is the fulcrum. We talk about the military-industrial complex. He said that's what it was in Eisenhower's era. Now it's become much more complicated. Now you have to throw in Congress, you have to throw in the media, you have to throw in think tanks, and he said the media is the fulcrum. It's the fulcrum. It is the thing without which this whole system cannot work. And what's happened is that the media have been taken over by people who also have control over the political class by means of their campaign financing. And effectively, they're all singing to the same, song sheet because they're ultimately all controlled by the same cabal of billionaires. And that's where we're at today. They're the same ones who control the military industrial complex, the merchants of death, Raytheon, McDonnell Douglas, and so forth, Boeing. They control the major media corporations. They finance the campaigns of the major politicians in the United States to the tune of billions of dollars. And so what you have is they're telling everybody what to say. The think tanks, the media, the politicians. That's why they're all saying the same thing, because they're all controlled by the same people.
Okay, one more question here.
Hey. Thanks, Dimitri. When I'm debating band rights online, the one area I get stumped on is MH17. From what I look online, now, what we hear is that it was shot down by pro-Russian Donbass separatists. I still don't know. What's your opinion on that? Who shot down MH17?
I don't have an opinion. I don't know enough about that subject to offer an opinion. I just know from having read sporadic reports that there are people in the alternative media who contest the Western narrative, but I really can't offer an opinion.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so everybody, thank you very, very much for I think everybody agrees that was a fabulous presentation. Lots of really good information and food for thought. I'm going to call upon Ken Stone to thank Dimitri, but before I go there, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Palestine. We've had a decades-long illegal occupation and suppression of the Palestinians have gone on for decades, and the Security Council and everybody else refuses to take any actions to support and to help the Palestinians. And just a few days ago, we had this invasion into Jenin, where 12 Palestinians were murdered and 100 left wounded, and of course the ambulances were prevented from reaching the Palestinians and taken to the hospitals, and those few that did make it to the hospital itself was bombarded with tear gas. So anyways, I'd just like to say that there's been another occupation that's been going on for decades, and the Ukrainian occupation, as horrid as it is, within a matter of months the West have come together and we're putting all kinds of arms and munitions into Ukraine to repel the oppressors. I just wish to hell that they start putting some effort into the Palestinian cause so they can repel their oppressors. So anyways, with that, I would like to pass over to Ken Stone, who was instrumental in calling this meeting, having this meeting happen today. So Ken.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sid. On behalf of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, and at the very end of Dimitri's very long Canada-wide tour for peace, there are some people I'd like to thank. First of all, I'd like to thank Sid Ryan for chairing this meeting and being one of the people instrumental in having this meeting after we were canceled here in Toronto. And I loved his comments about freedom of speech and freedom of association. So thank you very much, Sid. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Toronto Public Library for having this meeting here. The library has a robust policy of free expression, which is demonstrated here today in the face of intense backlash by certain people and certain, I hesitate to use the word journalists and politicians in this city. So thank you, Toronto Public Library. Thirdly, I'd like to thank all of you brothers and sisters who came out today, because by doing so, you were strengthening your right and the right of all Canadians to free speech and free association, which you might think you have a right to because it's written in the Canadian Constitution. But we do not have, I can tell you, after the last 3 weeks, Canadians, fellow Canadians, you do not have the automatic right to freedom of speech and freedom of association in this country. It's at the whim of the government, who has their notwithstanding clause, and nobody will stand up when we are canceled and chased from venue to venue but you. So thank you for coming out today. I'd like to thank the organizers of this particular meeting. That's Jason and Julio and Barry in particular for making this meeting happen against great odds. Kiri over there as well. And I hope I haven't omitted anyone. And I'd like to thank our talented organizers from across the country who overcame every obstacle to see this tour come off. Finally, I have to thank Dimitri. Dimitri has done a marvelous job in widening the discourse, creating a space in the Canadian public discourse in this country against the overwhelming narrative, the overwhelmingly pro-war narrative. Dimitri has opened the space where it's possible to challenge the continual refueling of this war by the Trudeau government with endless arms and money. And Dimitri has widened the space where we can talk about a negotiated end to this conflict. Dimitri has also been extremely generous with his money, financially generous. He financed his tour of his mission to peace to Russia. That cost him at least $10,000. On this tour, Dimitri paid for all his airfares, he paid for all his hotels, he paid for all his meals. The money that we collected, and I'm proud to say that we collected $288 here today in that collection. Thank you for that. That money goes towards paying just the room rentals and the costs of AV. So Dimitri was extremely generous financially, and he was extremely generous with his time. This tour was supposed to last 2 weeks. Instead, it lasted 3 weeks. And so we thank you for all this, Dimitri, and for your continuing fight for peace. Thank you very much. One more thing, brothers and sisters. Someone asked, how do we build a movement? Tomorrow, there will be a demonstration at the U.S. consulate at 1 p.m. The slogans are hashtag no to war, hashtag no to NATO. Please attend at 1 p.m. at the U.S. Consulate. And anybody in this room who wants to come out for a beer afterwards, we're going to the Fox and Firkin at 51 Eglinton East, and we've reserved 25 spaces, so get there fast. Thank you again.